Alright, class, settle down, settle down. Sarah, no gum? So, I've received some student feedback, really wanting to know about this topic. So today we're going to watch a few videos on it. They're all pretty short, so just please try to pay attention. This first one is kind of bad. The guy in it is really annoying, but here we go. We'll start with this one.
Hey y'all, it's Nolan, and welcome back to the most disturbing films of all time. In this episode, we're tackling the topic of educational shock films, specifically those related to driving and driver's ed, as per your viewer requests. Now, there are a lot of these kinds of films, and given that they're all pretty short, I chose to review 3, and I chose these 3 in particular because of their individual notoriety. However, these things are all also really similar, so the synopses and reviews are going to be a bit different from past episodes, and they might come off as a little bit brisk. I also just want to real quick respond to a few other comments I've received. Look, the videos on this channel are in fact reviews, exploring and discussing the themes, morals, implications, storytelling, as well as the historical and cultural significance of films that people tend to consider disturbing. What these videos are not are freebooted exhibitions of the entirety of some kind of graphic film. Not only is that not something I do on this channel, but in the vast majority of cases for what this series deals with, showing you most of this stuff would majorly violate the terms of service on YouTube and have the video or the entire channel removed. Almost everything we've looked at so far, and almost everything we plan to look at going forward, are easily available, either in physical form such as DVD, or in a number of different ways online. If you wanted to see the entirety of the first Faces of Death, for example, then I suggest you go find it and watch it. It really isn't that hard to do. Now, with all that out of the way, let's take our first step into these driver's ed shorts by learning about the origins of these things.
Alrighty, so hopefully the next one's a little bit more engaging this time.
Hey, you down there! Yes, you! Do you know about social guidance films? No? Perhaps you know them by their other popular name, mental hygiene films. Not that either, huh? Well, aren't you fucking useless? Predominantly following the Second World War, many nations, but most especially the United States, began to experiment with ideas of socially and culturally beneficial education through film, and the relatively recent advent of affordable film technology led to the creation and proliferation of a whole host of shorts styled similarly to military and occupational training reels. These films focused on teaching the public, particularly young adults, important lessons on friendship, dating, civic responsibility, and basic household safety. Usually called social guidance films, these things were everywhere during the post-war period, and the frequently cheesy style was easily recognizable to the baby boomer generation, becoming a target for spoof and parody throughout the later half of the 20th century.
If it weren't for zinc oxide, you wouldn't have that bar of soap. The dish towels you use every day. Your toaster. That brassiere you're wearing.
Within this broad and interesting context of short educational films came the Ohio Department of Highway Safety. They set a goal for reducing automobile fatalities by creating a film that would expose the driving public to the horrors and realities of high-speed collision and death. Despite obvious controversy, this approach became common throughout the whole of the United States, and by the 1970s there were a seemingly endless number of shocking and grotesque short films being shown to new drivers and high school students. Although these driving films would utilize the same melodramatic narration and motifs of civic pride, they also exhibited legitimate footage of gore and death. Now, some idiots might think things like this.
In the 70s and 80s, there was functionally no way to sate the morbid curiosity of what death and gore looked like. Unless you were a combat veteran, medical professional, or worked in emergency, you wouldn't have ever seen what it looked like for someone's arm to be cut off or something, and you never would have been able to. So something like Faces of Death and the numerous movies that came copying it were the only way for a lot of people to actually see that kind of stuff.
But in reality, many people in the 70s and 80s had their first experience with gore forced upon them in school because of these unique social guidance films. Speaking of the Ohio Department of Highway Safety, let's take a look at their revolutionary seminal short.
Alright, Dustin, will you stop that? Anyway, here's the next one. If you start to feel sick, you can step outside for a second.
Released in 1959 and produced by the Ohio Department of Highway Safety, Signal 30 is, to my knowledge, the first of the infamous Driver's Ed shock films. Immediately opening with the dramatic image of the wreckage and dead body from a collision into a tree, the film then follows with a disclaimer explaining that what we are about to see is in fact real footage. We're next shown a poorly acted and edited skit of a police officer answering an emergency call and then arriving on the scene of a fatal accident.
You say 2 persons have been killed and there are several others injured. Have you called an ambulance? Your name? Telephone number?
764. Okay, on the Signal 30 en route.
This leads us into the narrator explaining the meaning of the film's name.
Signal 30 is the phrase that means another violent death on the highway.
The first of the several accidents is a double Signal 30 between a farm truck and a family car, the result of running a stop sign. The film then takes some time to focus on that aforementioned stop sign and people's general apathy towards it. We then get a somewhat out-of-place segment discussing how the patrolmen are trained by showing off their Hot Wheels, playing on the monkey bars, and harassing people trying to get to work. From this point on, the film is essentially just a compilation of accident footage with dramatic and sometimes cheesy narration and music, as we next see another accident involving a tanker truck which burst into flames, and we're shown the charred remains of one of the drivers. After a couple more accident scenes, we get the most succinct version of the film's thesis.
Every accident has at its base a violation of a traffic rule.
And later on, the narrator expresses his justification for why such a film exists at all.
We're cruel, cold, and harsh, you say? You shouldn't be made to see and hear this? How could we give a better lesson on carelessness?
Following several more segments of accidents and death footage, we're then shown a brief interview between a woman whose husband had died and the patrolman who had to inform her when it happened. The film then closes its 27-minute runtime with what at first seems to be a pleasant ending before switching to a slideshow of a few more corpses, though this time set to the exact kind of cheesy triumphant orchestration that inadvertently makes the whole thing a little bit funny.
You can be, if you wish, just another Signal 30.
So as you might expect, this film is pretty repetitive, so here's a quick rundown. Signal 30 features footage from 16 accidents, and shows on screen 9 injured people, 15 dead bodies, and 1 possibly hurt cow. Aside from the general idea of automobile safety, there is a more focused message on the dangers of speeding specifically. So Signal 30 is pretty well made. I was actually a bit surprised that it was in color, albeit very muted. The narration and music definitely ages it and can make it hard to take seriously in some places, but it's exactly what it claims to be, and the long shots focusing on the battered remains of accident victims are definitely not easy to look at. Despite some controversy, Signal 30 ultimately received acclaim and even awards for being an unflinching and ostensibly effective portrayal of the realities of vehicular death. This film, as well as the others, is in the public domain, and in the nearly 65 years since its release, it has been shown to tens of thousands of new and learning drivers, concerned members of the public, and emergency personnel. The Ohio Department of Highway Safety wasn't done yet, though. Having gotten a taste of filmmaking, they soon followed up Signal 30 with a sequel.
Alright, so how's everyone doing? Alright, good. The next one's really similar to the last, so just try to stay focused, y'all.
Released in 1961, Mechanized Death is Safety Enterprises Inc.'s follow-up to the previous Signal 30. Similar to its predecessor, Mechanized Death opens up immediately on footage of wreckage and a deceased driver, with an accompanying narration. The title is then shown over very quickly alternating clips of mangled cars and dead bodies, which immediately transitions to the Superman theme? The opening segment of the film is a celebration of the engineers, contractors, and other workers responsible for the design and construction of the highway and interstate systems. This segues into the first of our several fatal accidents, and it's in this segment where we're introduced to a secondary narrator, though I'm not sure what reason there is for his inclusion or why he says this sentence this way.
When you choose to live a little longer, you may also help another live his life to the full.
Not long into the never-ending slog of death and destruction, we get a brief explanation of why this footage exists at all.
The sort of details have to be recorded on film for the Highway Patrol's comprehensive report.
Although obvious in hindsight, I appreciated the inclusion of this information, and it's a useful way of avoiding accusations of being pure exploitative shock. Next, we are introduced to the fancy new traffic patrol helicopter, paid for by the fine Ohio taxpayers. This is followed by a humorous segment about a drunk driver set to silly music. Thankfully, he was unharmed and seems to have been let off with a warning due to his cool-ass balloon-blowing skills. Oh no! We next get to see what I assume is a reenactment of his court case and sentencing. Don't drink and drive, kids. Actually, while we're on the topic of some legitimately good advice, a bit more than halfway into Mechanized Death, the narrator explains the concept of 10 out of 2.
10 minutes for rest and relaxation out of each 2 hours of long-distance driving. It avoids fatigue.
As someone who's personally experienced the sensation of highway hypnosis and the fatigue of extremely long drives, this is seriously good advice. I recommend next time you take a particularly long drive to actually try and use the 10 out of 2 method. It really helps. After more compilations of horrific death footage and contractors building roads, we're introduced to a highway patrolman who gives a speech on what all these deaths are like from his perspective.
Well, if you could ride with us for 1 week, or maybe even just 1 day, I know that you would feel much the same as I do.
The film then ends its 25-minute runtime with a final bit of footage of an injured victim crying out in pain. Mechanized Death features footage from 17 accidents and shows on screen 3 injured people, 1 dead tree, and 18 dead bodies. The focus of this film is a combination of the moral take time to think and a strong message against drunk driving specifically. So Mechanized Death has a much more severe tone than Signal 30, and when that's combined with the higher concentration of violence and gore, it definitely cuts down on the cheese factor. It makes this one significantly more disturbing. Additionally, among the deceased victims we see, there are 2 children, one of which was only about 6 months old. Even today in hardcore online gore communities, child death, especially very young children, is usually a taboo, so the inclusion of that in Mechanized Death was both a huge surprise and a pretty powerful, punch to the spirit. After these 2 shorts proliferated widely, other parts of the US began to follow suit, creating a trend that continued for many decades to come, which leads us into our next and final film.
Alright, I think I might be abusing this framing device a bit.
Released in 2005, Red Asphalt V is predictably the 5th installment in the California Highway Patrol's series of shocking driver's ed films. After a creative opening title, the film, like the others before it, jumps directly into video of a car that presumably struck a tree and the dead body inside it. We're then suddenly taken into a morgue where a young man, actor Steven Steelman, gives us a stern talking to about the reality and importance of what we're about to see.
Vehicle crashes kill more than 42,000 Americans each year, and crashes are the #1 cause of death among teenagers.
After the opening bit, the rest of the film combines the footage of accidents and deaths with testimonials from survivors, loved ones, and CHIP's officers. The film then ends its 15-minute runtime returning to Steelman in the morgue, giving a succinct final message, followed by credits. Red Asphalt V features footage from 12 accidents and shows on screen 6 injured people and 20 dead bodies. The focus of this film is the importance of safe driving for teens and young adults, specifically. So despite being of the same genre, Red Asphalt V is different from Signal 30 and Mechanized Death. The testimonials are definitely more emotionally heavy than the narration, and the nearly 50-year technological jump to full-color analog video means that the gory images are far more detailed and hard to look at. Since the primary audience is young adults, all of the victims featured in the gory footage are in their late teens and early 20s, which adds a greater disturbing element considering their age. So I turned 16 in 2005 when the short came out. So although I didn't see this one when I learned to drive, I was the exact target audience, and an unexpected consequence of that is that the opening and closing bits somehow feel even more aged than the narration from the 50s and 60s, and that did undercut the severity for me personally just a tiny bit. But that said, Red Asphalt V is definitely the most upsetting of the three. On average, Signal 30 features an on-screen death about once every 2 minutes. Mechanized Death increased that to about once every 90 seconds. But Red Asphalt V, with half the runtime of the others, features an on-screen death about once every 40 seconds, a way higher concentration. Thankfully, hundreds of thousands of Americans, most of them still driving, have seen these films, and others like them, making us all much safer on the road. It does make us safer, right? Oh, so we just got rid of the whole teacher projector thing? I came into this project with 2 primary questions. First, do these films cause any emotional or psychological harm to the people that view them? And second, do these films actually accomplish their intended goal in making people drive more safely? As far as that first question goes, I was a bit surprised that there isn't a lot of peer-reviewed research on the matter, but that isn't to say there's no information at all. Canadian forensic psychiatrist Dr. John Bradford has discussed numerous times the real potential for gruesome videos of violence, death, and gore to be a cause for legitimate PTSD, and this is reflected in diagnostic manuals such as the DSM-5 or other mental health literature. Though, in the reported cases I could find of severe PTSD or similar emotional distress from viewing disturbing videos, there's usually, if not always, other variables, such as a personal relationship or knowledge of the subject depicted in the video, previous experience or connection to something specifically shown in the video, or the video being suddenly seen without context or against the viewer's will. Similar research regarding the mental health of journalists and news crews who regularly view graphic content indicated that the most significant factor seems to be the frequency of exposure, so the more they see it, the worse it is for them. What I couldn't find at all was any peer-reviewed scientific publication talking about negative psychological effects on people who freely choose to view violent or gory content that they otherwise have no connection to, though it's not like that particular case is important for this series. My second question on whether or not these films are even effective was more surprising to me. Despite our intuitions, the research, and there is a good bit of it, strongly indicates that the scared straight approach of Signal 30 or Red Asphalt does not in any way make people safer drivers, and in fact, the very opposite could be true. Part of the reason is likely found in some cognitive biases, which if you don't know are well-documented flaws in human thinking. It turns out people, and I mean all people, including you and me, are not naturally designed to understand or apply statistics in our daily lives. Both the optimism bias and the normalcy bias are incredibly common, and they basically amount to us wildly underestimating real risks and potential harms in our lives. This is especially the case when the risk is something we experience and survive frequently. Think about it like this. You pass someone on the road when you probably shouldn't, and you're fine. So you do it again months later. and again months after that. You don't even think about the fact you're doing it or how often, and since you've survived every time you do it, your brain calculates that as essentially a 0% chance of danger or harm. Then you do it again, and that's the time you collide with another car. 100% chance of death. Cognitive biases like these, as well as other factors, are not lessened when we see someone else's dead body. The sad fact is, unless it's our dead body, our brains just don't adjust the calculation, and when it is our dead body, our brains aren't doing very many calculations anymore. Funny enough, subtle references to these cognitive biases are present in the Driver's Ed shock films.
How many ifs dominate your driving habits?
This boy thought he was pretty sharp. It seems, however, he had too flippant an attitude.
Statistics. That won't happen to me.
But even knowing you have a bias doesn't necessarily get rid of it. Even more interesting is that the ineffective scare you safe approach doesn't require gruesome imagery. Aotearoa New Zealand has created several PSAs on safe driving that are deeply disturbing in their own right, but they feature not a drop of blood or gore.
Mate, oh, I'm so sorry. I thought there was time.
He just pulled out. I don't have time to stop.
Oh, come on, mate. It was a simple mistake.
I know if I was going a bit slower.
Please. I've got my boy in the back.
I'm going too fast. I'm sorry.
Despite how powerful and dramatic that video is, even this campaign doesn't seem to have been effective, which we can see from the road fatality statistics. From 2012 to 2014, when PSAs like that one were made and released to the public, there were 85 fatalities where speeding was a factor each year. It's a pretty small country, so 85 is actually a lot. Yet 2015 had a dramatic spike to 105 deadly speeding crashes, and every year since has actually been far worse, with the most recent year on record, 2021, having 122 fatalities from speeding. That's a damn near 150% increase. And these statistics are very similar in the US, Canada, and Australia as well. The grim and counterintuitive reality is that if these short films have any effect at all, they've actually taken lives, not saved them. And when you combine that with the fact that showing these to young people might also cause emotional stress or even PTSD, the moral is obvious. These films and countless others like them should never again be shown to new and learning drivers. Instead, modern educational research shows that a more effective approach would be something called positive modeling. In other words, rather than focusing on what not to do, you spend time demonstrating what safe driving is, and then you provide good opportunities for students to practice the safe driving skills that have been shown to them. This positive modeling approach is the standard in most education and occupational training and should become the standard for driving instruction in any places where it isn't already. So the final question is, of course, how disturbing are these things? Well, individually, Signal 30, Mechanized Death, and Red Asphalt V could all be in different places, but given they're very similar and there are literally dozens more like them, I decided to average them all out as one thing. There's a part of me that thought maybe these should tie with Faces of Death. However, the fact that these short films feature only real footage of gore, including young people and even infants, and we consider that the vast majority of people that have seen these things were essentially forced to, I think they shoot up quite a few places. In the end, I'd personally put the Driver's Ed shock films collectively right behind Salo on the disturbing films ranking list. Now honestly, I don't actually recommend these, not only because of the possibility it'll make us all worse drivers, but they really aren't necessary viewing. If you're interested in the quirky history of social guidance films, there are way more interesting and famous, albeit less gruesome, examples to check out. And if you just want to satiate your morbid curiosity, there are also an endless supply of more engaging options, many of which include identical to footage to what these have to offer. So there's just no point in watching any of these. So that was our Driver's Education Spectacular. Thanks again to those of you that made the requests. Here's the Disturbing Films list, as always. If there's anything on this list you'd like to see soon, or anything not on this list that you really think should be, then let me know in the comments below, and perhaps yours will be the next viewer request. And if you want to catch the next episode of The Most Disturbing Films of All Time as soon as it comes out, then don't forget to subscribe. Remember, speed is a relative matter. It's what comes with it that kills. Thanks for watching.